to have your company. This is Roundtable. So, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has told the West that the risk of nuclear conflict should not be underestimated. And that is the starkest warning yet that stakes are being raised in the conflict over Ukraine. Lavrov was asked directly on Russian television about the possibility of nuclear war.
Really, the risks are really considerable, and I would not want to elevate those risks artificially. Many would like that. The danger is serious, real, and we must not underestimate it.
David Foster with you. Good to have you along. If it comes to anything like that, does NATO have the weapons to defend itself? There have already been enormous displays of Russian firepower. The first use of a hypersonic weapon in anger, able to travel at least 5 times the speed of sound. It can hit a target before existing missile systems have time to react. A nuclear saber rattling with the test firing of the Satan II by Russia, which can carry up to 15 separate nuclear warheads. Is the West falling behind in the development of new armaments? Very pleased to say that we can welcome back to our studio Robert Fox, defense editor of the Evening Standard. We go to Washington, D.C., where we see David DeRoche, a former official in the U.S. Department of Defense. And in Bradford, United Kingdom, Christopher Blood, professor in international relations and security at the University of Bradford. Great to have you all with us. David, let me come to you first of all, because an awful lot has been said by Russia about what capabilities it has and how the rest of the world should be very fearful. Do you think the United States has got anything really to worry about when it comes to defending against the type of armaments we've heard spoken of?
Yeah, we always have something to be concerned about with Russia and new armaments. The characterization of Russia as a gas station with nukes isn't too far off the mark. There is a robust and advanced defense industry in Russia. But that being said, the preoccupation of Russian defense for the last 30 years or so has been to restore mutual assured destruction and defeat the possibility of U.S. missile defense. And I think that the announcement of hypersonics and things of that have to be taken in that context.
Okay, in terms of the technical details here, could the U.S. missile defense system stop hypersonic missiles? Could it stop any warheads being released by Satan II?
Well, there's no U.S. missile defenses against Russia at the moment. The U.S. missile defense shield is along the Pacific coast and in Alaska. It's oriented towards North Korea and China. So by design, there is still mutually assured destruction. If the capabilities are as advertised, conventional missile defense systems would be very, very challenged. The issue is partially with the interceptors, but the idea is that a hypersonic missile that truly functions in this way would be able to change course, and that would make it harder to acquire and track the missile.
Was it you, Robert, that said you didn't think that's what had actually been used in Ukraine, because otherwise they would have changed the direction of these missiles?
It's very unclear what they have been using. As David has been saying, we've been hearing an awful lot about what is being advertised. And in reality, things are turning out to be very different. We see at the great parades, and there'll be another one on May the 9th, we see parades of these missiles and vehicles, which I think all three of us look at to say, gosh, what have they got next in the toy cupboard? And out it comes. And isn't it very surprising, gentlemen, that how little of this actually becomes operational very quickly? They have shown some new super tanks, including the T-14, the T-90. They have not been conspicuous with their presence on the battlefield of Ukraine. So I agree with what David has said. It's the amount of effort and money and the industrial effort being put into Russian defense industry is conspicuous, and it is very, very worrying. But how much it can actually deliver, what it was expected to deliver from February the 24th, has really been performance has fallen below expectation, and yet they've been reforming them ever since a near debacle in South Ossetia, Georgia in 2008.
Let's go through some of the numbers here. Russia's military expenditure increased by 2.9% fairly recently, reaching $65.9 billion. Behind India, $76.6 billion, way behind China, $293 billion. And on the distant horizon, compared to the United States, $801 billion. So 65.9 Russia, 800 plus billion United States. So says the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And interestingly, Russia is the second biggest exporter of conventional weapons, 19% of the market, but the United States more than double that, 39%. Christopher, let me come to you. How is it that a nation with 1/10, it appears from those figures, of the military expenditure of the United States can threaten global peace unless it has the most advanced technology?
Well, what we've seen, obviously, in this conflict is that the conventional capability of Russia is not as effective as we thought it might be. And especially, they're not capable of this combined arms strategy that is necessary for success in this kind of campaign. And a lot of the weapons they're using are not very high precision weapons. They have some, obviously. They have very modern technology, but most of the equipment they have is not that well endowed with technology.
But you would not necessarily need to have a great deal of the high-end technology to cause a great deal of destruction, would you?
Well, this is what they're doing. They're just hitting targets, civilian targets mostly. They're destroying urban environments, attacking civilians. The purpose of high precision weapons is to target only military targets very precisely, and that's not what the Russians are doing most of the time.
It's very primitive. Let's say that. It's stand back and blast. And they're doing it mostly with old-fashioned artillery, exactly as Christopher was saying. Really old-fashioned artillery and old-fashioned rocket systems like the Grad, which goes back to the Katyusha and Uncle Joe Stalin's organs in World War II. I would like to emphasize very, very strongly something that Christopher has said. The thing that has failed so conspicuously, and all the braggadocio we are getting even this very day from Lavrov and Putin, it fails on this, is the PBI, as they called it in World War I, the poor bloody infantry. The dismounted infantry soldiers have been performing poorly in Ukraine. And that has been a big surprise, because as Christopher was saying, that they're supposed to, when they were renewing the forces, the program began in 2008, accelerated through the teens from 2015, particularly after Crimea. They cannot do combined operations. And the key to combined operations, funny old-fashioned thing, is the combination of infantry with artillery and armor. And it's the inability to work infantry with tanks and with close support fighter ground attack, of which we have seen very little, which has been a complete failure.
Leads me to this, David, because of the perception or the reality that conventional warfare hasn't worked particularly well for Russia, should we therefore be even more concerned about what we hear from Sergei Lavrov about nuclear conflict shouldn't be underestimated, when they have been showing off this Satan II, it's got a proper name, that's its nickname, which can fire, I think, 15 nuclear warheads at once?
Well, I don't think we should be concerned about it. I think Lavrov's aim is to force self-deterrence on the West. And you can find this going back in Russian thinking to the Soviet Union with the efforts, the sponsorship of many well-meaning people with the Greenham Common protests in the 80s to deter the West from deploying cruise missiles to respond to the Soviet SS-20. So this is part of an old playbook. But I've got to emphasize Robert's point. It's remarkable. Even I recall serving with senior U.S. Air Force officers in Bosnia who thought that infantry was a synonym for untrained person with a rifle. And what we've really seen is that when you look at the Russian military, what you have are a lot of untrained or poorly trained people, and then you have some very high-end capabilities that, quite frankly, the West has not focused on deterring because we still have mutually assured destruction in place. So it doesn't matter if Russia has the ability to nuke Washington 1 time or 50 times, we still have a system in place, a construct where there are not supposed to be missile defenses. You know, Washington should be able to nuke Moscow, and Moscow should be able to nuke Washington. And we've accepted that since the 80s.
And this is where I want to play in. I want to play in Vladimir Putin, perhaps underlining what you've just said there, that this is, as you said, Robert, braggadocio, that he's actually sort of basically saying, hang on, we've got this, we don't want you to use yours in advance. This is the Russian president.
The system has the highest tactical and technical characteristics and is capable of overcoming all modern anti-missile defense systems. It has no parallels in the world and will not have for a long time. This truly unique weapon will strengthen the combat potential of our armed forces, reliably ensure the security of Russia from external threats, and make those who, in the heat of aggressive rhetoric, try to threaten our country think twice.
Christopher, that is what he's doing, isn't it? He's basically sort of saying, well, look, we've got this one thing here, but it's enough to cause a great deal of trouble, so don't push your luck with us.
Yes, but it's not the case that they are not deterred either. It's clear that Putin is trying to keep this within some limits. For example, we haven't seen any major attacks on the supply lines, and we haven't seen attacks reaching into Poland. In other words, Putin himself is clear that if he escalates to bring NATO informally into this war, then there is a risk of escalation that would be dangerous for Russia, because Russia is very, very vulnerable to a nuclear strike. The war could come to Moscow if Putin is careless and escalates too much.
And if it does go to Moscow, if things get to that particular point, I mean, the mad theory, mutually assured destruction, will we all destroy?
Yeah, the Strangelove approach. But I'm absolutely, it's funny, I'm absolutely on the side of agreement with my two fellow speakers. I think that this is the worry about Putin, is that careless talk may lead to careless gestures. And what I fear, Christopher, particularly the very point that you've raised, is that they could launch a medium-range missile, like the Iskander, which is the toy du jour at the moment, and there could be an overshot. If there is a conspicuous amount of overshot, or dribbling...
So what you're talking about is this lands in Ukraine...
in a NATO country.
And then, unfortunately, something goes into the NATO country from there.
And there's a catastrophe. Say, I hate to raise this kind of thing, but just supposing that they got the calibration wrong, and they've got these things within 60 kilometers, apparently, of the Ukraine-Russia border, and these things can go wrong, the guidance system. Supposing you knock out a major hospital in Krakow. Supposing you knock off a school in Latvia. I mean, God forbid that this should happen. Then it becomes a major issue. Mad, messing around, the king of narcissistic autocrats, Putin, it's no good. He has to be stopped at that point.
What do we make of the Orcas Pact in terms of protecting against Russian threats, perhaps in the future? This was Australia, US, United Kingdom announced about 4 or 5 months ago to do with submarine warfare, etc., etc. This is from the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison.
Now, these missiles, hypersonics, are one of the fastest developing area of missile technology. And while Australia, together with our partners and allies, have very sophisticated and very advanced forms of defence, hypersonics are an area where we're looking to significantly upgrade our capabilities. And they're part of modern warfare.
What about, Robert, what about the Orcas Pact? I mean, it's obviously not in place and working at this particular moment. Will it ever be, and will it be enough to...
Well, it's quite a curious story. The wish is very much father of the thought, and it's a lot of it, the submarine bit, is predicated on freedom of navigation and China. And China's obsession not only with the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and what is known as the Malacca Strait dilemma. We know that the leadership in China is obsessed with how much crucial commercial traffic, including fuels, comes up through the Malacca Straits. And they've got to hold that. And there has been near war, certainly economic war, over the past 18 months to 2.5 years between China and Australia. And Australia was saying, can you help us with the submarines? The submarines made the headline. From what I understand, with people who are involved in negotiating this, and I'm sure David must know some people, it's really about the technology. Equally now, it's about cyber. And now they are very worried about the Chinese prowess as well as the Russian, particularly the Chinese in hypersonics.
Let's pick up something from that Scott Morrison soundbite that we put in there, that little clip, in which he says, David, hypersonics are an area where we're looking to significantly upgrade our capabilities. They're part of modern warfare. Are we not hearing what the United States and its partners are up to? Because those positions of power don't want the other side to know exactly how far they've got, or is, as Scott Morrison suggesting, it a game of catch-up?
It's a game of catch-up. Robert's right. I mean, AUKUS is primarily about China, but I think that there's a commonality of perception. And to be frank, Australia is the thought leader in recognizing the Chinese threat and how the Chinese threat is evolving. The issue of hypersonics was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, look, we're behind on this. And he called for a Sputnik. He called it a Sputnik moment, which, there's a couple of things, Manhattan Project, Marshall Plan, Sputnik moment. That's a call for national mobilization and a recognition that we may be a step or two behind. So I think it makes sense to see, the three closest allies, United States, Britain, and Australia, come together on that. It's a natural development. It's part of an evolution of an established relationship.
Which might lead me to think, Christopher, and I'll ask you about this one, that this is about a new arms race, not necessarily focused entirely on what we're seeing Russia doing at the moment, but a new global realignment.
Well, the issue of hypersonics is important. I think the United States has now at least 5 programs to develop hypersonic capabilities, but these are primarily directed at conventional forces. Of course, intercontinental ballistic missiles travel always at hypersonic speeds. They're incredibly fast, and Russia has no capability of degrading the American deterrent. So in that sense, for the time being, that is safe. So it's unclear how important hypersonics are really going to be in terms of long-range nuclear weapons. But again, in the context of China, the capability of China to use ballistic missiles against American naval assets is an important element of this issue of hypersonic weapons.
And it must say that very quickly must be said, the Americans and the Brits were taken very, very much by surprise by the Chinese launch because of the parabola, because of the arc that it used, and it was not exclusive to the northern hemisphere, but it really gathered in the whole of the southern hemisphere. So that's where there was. It wasn't a rethink; it was a rain check moment. We've got to think what the full implication it is, and the high Arctic and the high Antarctic are going to be very, very important. So you will see Canada, I think, within a year in the AUKUS agreement. They are close allies. They absolutely trust each other, and there's real confidence between them, and that's the way that this happens. And you will not see, unfortunately, for very good historical and actual reasons, a European partner in it.
Do you know, I'm surprised in this conflict that we haven't seen, yes, we've seen cyber skirmishes, but we have not seen one enormous cyber hit, because if it happened, and if it were directed in the right, call it the wrong place, that could be a complete game changer. David, do you want to pick up on that? Surely that's the best weapon you could have at your disposal.
Well, I think there has been cyber activity. I think that it hasn't been publicized, and there is an element of mutually assured deterrence here as well. You recall that under the Trump administration, there was sort of a handshake agreement that some sectors were not to be touched. on both sides between the United States and Russia. I think that there has been a lot of action on the Russian and the Belarusian rail network. I think that we're also starting to see issues with explosions and fires at selected Russian higher research institutes. Their premier institute for air defense, for example, just burned down a few days ago. They've had 3 in the past 5 days. I'm not sure how much of that is cyber, but there's clearly something going on. The problem is if you're under cyber attack, it's like being jammed on the radio. You don't acknowledge it because that allows your adversary to know how effective you've been.
As a journalist, can I just say how it only occasionally has popped into the news agenda, and it popped into the news agenda in a most peculiar way. I think my colleagues may agree. It was that Israel was not going to sell the spyware Pegasus to either Estonia or Ukraine. And you look at the list of autocratic regimes that Israel does sell Pegasus to, you thought that there was a warning off, there was some sort of trade-off going on there. And I agree, we're not hearing about cyber for very obvious reasons, and we're not hearing about EW per se, electronic warfare. And I'm pretty sure there's a heck of a lot of that going on.
I'm going to come back to you in a minute because I know you're more worried about chemical weapons and biological weapons perhaps than what we're talking about at the moment. But Christopher, let me throw this one at you. David talks about the fact that under Trump, some sort of gentleman's agreement was reached in which certain targets were off limits. How long does that stay the case when somebody on the other side is threatening that they could use nuclear warheads? Surely you would want to take any opportunity you have to take that out of the equation.
Well, yes, obviously, once you cross the threshold to nuclear use, then there is the possibility that all bets are off and there's going to be a full-scale exchange. But nevertheless, I think it's important to understand that the use of one nuclear weapon does not mean full-scale escalation.
But Bob, I want to ask you about chemical weapons, biological weapons, because they are easier in a sense, but equally they are open to the same sort of condemnation that we saw in Syria when it was supposedly a red line that shouldn't be crossed, and it turned out to be nothing of the sort. The West did absolutely diddly.
Well, this is where I turned my role as a journalist completely on its head. It's a lovely witchword to get people to talk about. You guys as professionals must see this all the time. But unfortunately, I'm finding in this particular conflict, it's the big unknown. Briefers up to 3-star level, who I know and trust very well, are very, very worried about it because we're in Rumsfeld territory here. We're going between known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And we've got this with General Dovinikov, who we've known sanctioned the use of chemical weapons by Syrian allies, possibly even under some Russian supervision in Aleppo and other parts of Syria. Whether they will use it or not, I am not clear. It will be crude stuff. I suspect basically it would be mostly chlorine. Biological weapons, I'm still Pollyanna-ish enough to think that biological weapons are almost as dangerous to the perpetrator as much as to the intended victim. But part of the thing that is now consistent is there's a wild conspiracy theory promoted now by Putin himself that the Brits, the Germans, and the Americans have been supervising a chemical and biological warfare factory deep underground in, guess where? Mariupol. And this is why, and it's come up on some of the propaganda channels. I think it's even been once or twice on state TV. This shows us why we are fighting a war of defense. Okay. And so it's going, but what British intelligence, I can say that, fears is that you will get an accidental chemical exchange. And that is a thing that they do worry about.
And of course, you can't respond in kind.
Yeah.
Look, David, let me come to you on this particular one. If it comes to a full-scale shooting war between the major powers, and we're talking about worst-case scenario here, it's gunfight at the OK Corral, all bets are off, weapons are lobbed from side to side, and Putin has said, well, a world without Russia isn't really a world worth having at all. Would it be possible to stop that, or would it just be cataclysmic?
Oh, I think it's unthinkable. Yeah. I mean, we forget, but, the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which is really a colonial vestige, they have nuclear weapons there, and they're like 30 seconds flight time from Berlin. So, there's a lot of ugliness there. Let me, if I can, address the chemical weapon issue in a very, very sort of bloodless military engineer thing. Generally, chemical weapons are less effective. The hassle of delivering them is less effective than explosives unless you're dealing with extremely untrained people or a very constricted space. And what has me concerned is that when you look at the Mariupol defenders going underground, that's extremely difficult to root them out. I think it is becoming more and more probable that we'll see use of chemical weapons against the built-up facility in Mariupol, but I think it would be limited just to that because you're better off shooting high explosive in almost every other.
Perhaps that leads into your story about Putin's tale of them having underground facilities to build chemical. But I haven't got time.
Yeah,
I haven't got time. Well, thank you. Listen, I'm so sorry. I could have talked about that with you all for a great deal longer than the allotted 30 minutes that we have, but I appreciate your time. Come on again, please. Well, let's hope it ends before we have to ask you to come back on again, but ends in a way that we're all quite happy with. Listen, thank you very much indeed to my guests and to you, wherever you happen to be, for watching this edition of Roundtable. Hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.